On the morning of the 19th of June, I was sent forward with a party of surgeons to the field. The sight that met us was one I shall never forget. The ground was heaped with the dead and the dying, the smell of blood heavy in the air. Men lay where they had fallen, English, Scots, Hanoverians, and French together, their wounds swarming with flies under the hot sun. Many had lain there since the previous afternoon, and their cries for water were dreadful to hear. We went first to Haye Sainte, where the farmyard was choked with bodies. The wounded had crawled into every corner. Some still lived, though frightfully mangled, and were imploring us to take off limbs that hung by shreds. In one barn, I found near 50 men, most of them French, many already dead. The stench was overpowering. The surgeons were overwhelmed. We had little water, few instruments, and not half the bandages needed. Amputations were performed one after another, often without rest or relief. We used what we could find, shirts, straw, even torn saddlecloths, to bind the stumps. The men bore it with astonishing fortitude. I saw one guardsman have his arm removed above the elbow. He never uttered a sound until it was done, then thanked us for doing it cleanly. Through that whole day and night we worked, lit by lanterns hung from trees or bayonets driven into the ground. The groans and cries around us never ceased. By morning the church at Waterloo and every barn and house in the village were filled with wounded. There were thousands who could not be brought in, lying still upon the field, some already dead, some praying, others raving in delirium. It wasn't until the third day that we had dressed the last of the British wounded. Many French still remained unattended. Our men had done what they could, but the sheer numbers were beyond belief. I have seen many fields after battle, but none so terrible as Waterloo. It was slaughter on a scale that beggars description.
On the morning of the 20th, the wounded began to arrive in Brussels in dreadful numbers. Every cart, every wagon, every vehicle that could move was pressed into service. They came slowly, jolting along the cobbled streets, the poor fellows inside half dead from pain and thirst. Their uniforms were stiff with blood, many black with powder or caked in mud, their faces pale and ghastly with exhaustion. The hospitals, churches, and public buildings were soon overflowing. The great halls of the convents and barracks were lined with straw, upon which lay hundreds of wounded men in every stage of suffering. The groans of the mutilated, the prayers for water, the stifled cries of those undergoing operation made the place one of horror. I have never witnessed such a scene of human misery. The surgeons were incessantly employed. For 3 days and nights we scarcely left our work, taking rest only when nature absolutely demanded it. Amputations and dressings were carried on without intermission. We had no proper hospital arrangements. Everything was done upon the bare floors. Often I was obliged to hold a candle in one hand and the knife in the other, while a comrade steadied the patient. Yet I must say that the patience and courage of the men exceeded anything I have ever known. Many bore their sufferings in silence or with a jest upon their lips. A Highlander whose leg I removed thanked me, saying he was glad to have it off at last, as it had been tormenting him more than the French had done. When the first confusion had passed, the citizens of Brussels displayed great humanity. The ladies of the town visited the hospitals daily, bringing lint, linen, and soup. Many took the wounded into their homes, regardless of nationality. I saw English and French soldiers lying side by side, tended by the same hands. Still, the mortality was dreadful. The atmosphere of the wards became pestilential. Despite every effort, fever and gangrene spread. The groans of the dying were ceaseless for many days. It was a week before we had any semblance of order. The memory of those scenes will haunt me to my dying day.
The carnage on the field of Waterloo surpassed anything I had witnessed, even in the most terrible days of the Empire. The wounded lay so thick upon the ground that one could scarcely move without stepping upon them. The cries of the mutilated and dying rose from every side, mingled with the groans of the horses that lay crushed or disemboweled among the men. The ground was sodden with blood. Throughout the afternoon, I attended the wounded of the Imperial Guard working under continual fire. My ambulance wagons could scarcely approach. The rain had turned the fields to mud. My brave orderlies carried the wounded on their backs, sinking to the knees at every step. I saw men who had lost limbs still trying to drag themselves toward the rear, their faces set with a grim determination not to die within sight of the enemy. When the rout began, I refused to abandon the field. The roads were choked with fugitives, wagons, and wounded men. I had my operating table set up in a hollow near La Belle Alliance, where I continued my duties by the light of lanterns. My assistants and I worked the whole night without rest. We amputated, dressed wounds, and gave water to those beyond saving. Around us, the moans of the dying were incessant. I remember one young grenadier of the guard struck by a ball that shattered both legs. When told the operation must be performed, he merely said, "Faites vite, Monsieur Larrey. Be quick, sir," and smiled as I began. He expired before the bandage was tied. Such courage was not rare that night. Toward dawn, a patrol of Prussian hussars surrounded my position. I believed my life forfeit, but when I declared myself surgeon of the French army, they saluted me, and the officer, moved by my labors, ordered that I should be escorted in safety. Thus, I passed through their lines, still surrounded by the wounded whom I would not abandon. Of all the fields on which I have served, Egypt, Austerlitz, Eylau, Wagram, none equaled Waterloo for horror and destruction. Humanity seemed extinguished there. The wounded of both nations lay intermingled, imploring aid from heaven and from men. I did what I could, but God alone could show mercy amidst such desolation.
When I entered the hospital at Brussels, I felt as though I had stepped into a vision of hell. The courtyard was filled with wagons piled with the wounded. Within, the staircases, passages, and rooms were crowded, every corner occupied by some poor creature in agony. The smell of blood and corruption was overpowering. Many of the men had lain for 2 or 3 days without attention, having been brought from the field only after the most dreadful suffering. Some had bound their own wounds with scraps of uniform or with straw. Others had crawled 1/2 mile or more before falling exhausted. They lay in heaps upon the floors, their faces pale and drawn, their lips black with thirst. I had thought myself familiar with the sight of wounds, but nothing had prepared me for this. There were men with musket balls lodged deep in the chest, or limbs torn away by cannon shot. The groans and cries filled the air, yet among them were those who endured without complaint, men whose fortitude seemed almost superhuman. One soldier, with both legs fractured, begged only for a little water and smiled when it was brought to him. We began our work at once. I amputated from morning until night, often without pausing for food or rest. There was no order or system. We operated wherever there was space. The floor was slippery with blood. Instruments were scarce. Bandages were improvised from linen, torn from the shirts of the dead. The younger surgeons fainted at their work. I confess there were moments when I felt my heart sink within me. I can never forget the faces of the French wounded. They were mixed among our own, for the citizens of Brussels made no distinction. I dressed the arm of a young French officer who had been shot through the shoulder. He spoke calmly and even smiled as I worked, though I knew his wound was mortal. He died that evening, his hand still clasped in mine. When I left the hospital that night, the sun was setting over the city. The air was heavy with the smell of blood and infection. I walked home utterly exhausted, and when I closed my eyes, I saw again the faces of those men, the noble, the humble, the brave, all reduced to the same suffering. It was a sight that has left an impression upon my mind which no time can efface.